How are you guys? In my last video we chatted about events built leading up to the January 28th incident. So today I'm going to talk more about the forces involved, and General Ting Kai's 19th Route Army is the army that, and his forces and what equipment they use is what I'll be discussing today. Now, first off, the 19th Army consisted of 3 divisions: the 78th, the 60th, and the 61st. Now, these divisions in total were about 35,000 men. However, these 35,000 men were not as well equipped as the Japanese. They were all carrying the Henyang rifle. Service cap seems to be the main headwear, although you do see some a wide variety of headwear used by the 19th Route Army's forces. For me, I went for the service cap look and I chose the Airfix World War I British Infantry because obviously you shouldn't have the backpack on them, but without the backpack, they're as close as you can get without too much hard work. When the general had approached the city, as I had said before, the Japanese had about a section of naval infantry stationed at TianTong station. This section of naval infantry had then watched as sacked workers from Japanese businessmen who'd sacked their workforce because of demonstrations had started on the 27th, on the 26th and the 27th to build barricades here. And what I mean by defensive works, but these weren't trenches. The water table in Shanghai is far too high to allow for trenches, so all emplacements and fortifications are usually built up, not dug in. When General Ting Kai's 78th Army defended this position, it defended it from North Station all the way from down the track to from North Station, TianTong Station, to Qianguang Station. Then their lines folded to the left. This was a very good defensive position for General Ting Kai. Now, General Ting Kai was no amateur to warfare. His men had been under air attack before. Most of them were, they are warlord troops, but they are seasoned veterans. So, as we said, on the 26th and the 27th, Chinese labourers, but obviously under some Chinese military supervision, because the defence works seem to work to a pattern. I have a standard design. These defence works are established around TianTong Station and on the line of the Shanghai Wusong Rail. Now, this railway line is interesting as it's not built up on an embankment. Most of us imagine railway tracks built up on embankments, but this was not. If you look at the area around the station, and indeed massive areas of Shanghai are actually, you can't build on them because they're drainage centres. They are big sumps, as it were, because Shanghai is an estuarine city. It's subject to flooding, and as I said, the water level is high. So this ground here is very boggy. It isn't bog, but it is very boggy. These are drainage ditches, quite wide, about 12 foot wide, and very deep. And because of this flat ground and the position the Chinese held, when on the evening of the 27th and mornings of the 28th, as the Chinese forces moved into position, General Tin Kai announced, made it known that no, he is the Chinese army, he is a force of the central government, and he has every right to dare to put his forces in this area. But this was one last provocation. As we said, the Japanese Navy are looking to take some shine off the Japanese Army's performance in Manchuria, and they've been put out by the Japanese Army's performance in Manchuria, so the Japanese Navy's land forces will be attacking. Now, as I said previously, many of General Tin Kai's forces have infiltrated into the city as snipers. Now, as sniper activity intensified from early afternoon on the 28th, the Japanese response was to burn the building down, as we said. Now, so this meant that when the Japanese initially attacked, there were quite a few factors that they had underestimated. Now, one of the things they had underestimated is the effectiveness of their naval bombardment. Now, the naval bombardment was delivered by more than 10 ships, and the largest caliber gun was a 12-inch. So we have to wonder if the Japanese observers are on the naval depot and the Japanese Navy is in support with big heavy guns and air support, why did the Japanese attack on that night fail? There are many factors that contribute to the Japanese failure to break this line. The first one, of course, is that they underestimated the men they were facing themselves. These are men of the 78th Division. They've seen combat. Yes, they are a warlord army. Yes, they are not that well trained, but they are seasoned. And on this night, it appears they had full pouches of ammunition for this operation, because later the Chinese forces will suffer from ammunition shortages. Now, when we look at this army, when we look at the 19th Army, we're looking at an army, as I said, each division is 4 regiments, which is 2 brigades. Probably each battalion, 3 battalions to a regiment, 6 battalions to a brigade, and 2 brigades. When you look at a regiment, you're probably getting 4 medium machine guns per battalion, and for mortars, you would say 2 each at battalion level. But this battle was famous for the Chinese having good mortar support. There's one thing noted about this battle: the Chinese had very good mortar support, the 19th Third Army. So I decided to up the number of mortars present on the battlefield. The mortars would have been the basically a copy of the 81mm, 82mm Brandt Stokes models, produced locally in quite large numbers in many arsenals around China. Then I went for 120mm TianTong Type 14 mortars, because all records state for how many mortars there were. Now, many records state that the 19th Third Army did not have artillery support, but photographic evidence suggests that it did. And the guns were the 1903 Krupp 75mm mountain gun. Now, that's a good weapon in its day, but this is 1932, and we can assume that as far as these guns are concerned, their best days are behind them. There would not have been more than 4 of those guns to a division. So when we're looking at the 19th Third Army, we are looking at quite a well-equipped army by Chinese standards. This army has come from Guangdong, and that's quite a prosperous province, so these troops are quite well-equipped. with the Hanyang rifle, as I said. Now the LMG for the 19th Route Army and the LMG for the 5th Army that will later support the 19th Army is the SIG KE7. The SIG KE7 is really the LMG that signifies the Chinese side of the battle. You don't really see any other LMG in the Chinese forces around Shanghai and 32 other than the SIG KE7. I'm not talking about the 5th Army today, I'm just talking about the 19th Route Army. And when we look at medium machine guns, we can see the Maxim, and we can see the Shanghai knockoff of the Browning 1919 30 caliber medium machine gun, which is the Shanghai 310s medium machine gun. The Hanyang rifle is firing 7.92 round nose ammo. We don't know what the machine guns we're firing of, and there are different models of the Type 310 that were capable of firing the Hanyang, so I'm not going to get into that subject, because there were also, you can also see MG08s, Maxim guns, and MG0815s, which are the shoulder-fired version of the Maxim gun with a step-down breech. So, for me, as I said, I chose the Airfix World War I British Infantry to portray this battle. Now then, because we must ask ourselves, how did a naval bombardment with heavy guns fail the Japanese? How could they not have been able to adjust their fire when they were observing from the roof of the depot, of their naval depot? We have to ask ourselves, well, the main reason is that the Japanese naval bombardment wasn't very effective, and the reason for that is that this ground has a high water table and a soft soil. That's why when the Chinese had built their defenses, they built them up. And this means that the soil, and there's plenty of references to it, this meant that the soil was too soft for the Japanese armor-piercing high explosive shells to detonate. So many of these large caliber shells failed to explode, dug themselves into the soft soil, and didn't explode. Then we have to ask ourselves, just have a sip of my beer. Then we have to ask ourselves, why was this fire not adjusted? Well, as I said, the Japanese had been putting this area to the torch because of heavy sniper fire. They didn't have the men to flush the snipers out, so they just burnt the buildings down. And it was another way of flushing out the Chinese civilians anyway, who they didn't want to come back. So by the afternoon, when this battle gets started, observation from the Japanese depot was probably highly obscured by smoke. Then we have to look at the Japanese Navy's air assets. Now in Shanghai, these assets seem to be very timid indeed. There are no written records of the Japanese Navy air service attacking at below 1,500 meters. So they're delivering their attacks very high. There's very little ground support. This is the first time that the Japanese Navy has put on a combined operations battle, and it's finding itself that it has indeed underestimated a few of the problems. It will fail to use reconnaissance to probe these positions before it launches an attack. It's only a small number of its officers are trained in infantry tactics, but we'll get back to the IJNLF next time. We'll stick to the Chinese forces. So as you see, for the Chinese forces for this battle, I went at regimental strength. I gave them 2 mortars, a 120mm Hanyang Mukden 120mm Arsenal mortar, a Krupp 75mm mountain gun, and I could have opted for a Oerlikon 20mm autocannon 2. But usually when I do those things, I look at the 3 heavy weapons and then just roll a dice. And that decides which one the Chinese forces get. Okay, so we've looked at how Chinese forces were equipped. We've looked at the battlefield itself. We've seen how the Japanese naval bombardment was not as successful as what they wanted because many shells failed to explode. We've seen also how they, even though they have the high ground, they fail to utilize good observation, so they don't coordinate what little artillery they have on the ground effectively. As I said, the Japanese Navy really must have thought this was a walkover. They're going to suffer during this battle. They will suffer again and again from no reconnaissance, lack of reconnaissance. And as I said, the only thing, eventually, this battle will go from the afternoon of the 28th until the afternoon of the 29th. During the night, when the Japanese have burnt all these buildings, another thing they have done is they are silhouetted against the burning buildings as they approach the Chinese lines. So that is another asset that they didn't think of when they set the buildings alight. But also General Ting Kai has got a few more things up his sleeve. He will be getting some support, because remember, this is Chiang Kai-shek's way of being a strong man against Japanese provocation with deniability, but at the same time being able to use this to win support for his bid at Generalissimo of China at the Congress of the KMT. So he does give some support, and the support is a surprise to the Japanese, because the support is 3 armored trains. Now, these armored trains carry 75mm guns. There is a battalion of armored trains are sent to be used in the defense of Shanghai against the Japanese attack. Now, these trains are quite a shock to the Japanese indeed, when on the afternoon, early on the afternoon of the 29th, they roll down the rail track, blazing away with their 75mm guns. Now this is the final straw for the Japanese, and they withdraw, and the battle for the next few weeks will settle into a long-range firefight, with the Japanese defending certain streets and using the burnt houses in between as a no-man's land with heavy patrol activity. The armoured trains that Chiang sends, one will run on the line from North Shanghai Station to Kiangwon Station and will directly support General Ting Kai's troops, and the other is at North Station, also in direct support of men of the 78th Division. So there we have a few elements of why the Japanese didn't do as well at this battle as they thought, and they really had underestimated the Chinese forces. So always remember, the Chinese soldier fought with the least for the longest. Take care. Bye.